Chapter 4, The Revolutionary Era. Section 1, The Road to Revolution, in which we will be discussing the events that led up to the Revolutionary War and caused it to happen. Basic idea of the section is that a series of restrictive laws angered many American colonists, leading to rebellion against Britain. In short, the colonies didn't like the laws that Parliament was putting on them. Vocabulary: Samuel Adams, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, Writs of Assistance, Boston Massacre, Committees of Correspondence, the Intolerable Acts, First Continental Congress, and Minutemen. Now, the colonists had already had a long history of trouble with Britain. Religious persecutions, the rebellion against Andros, the Navigation Acts. The new taxes and new laws that are going to be handed down by Britain are just adding fuel to the fire. They're just making a situation that's already been tense approach a breaking point. In 1763, Parliament passed the Proclamation of 63. This act prevented colonists from being allowed to expand west past the Appalachian Mountains, as indicated by the red line on this map. This upset colonists because part of the reason the war started to begin with is that the French were in the way of westward expansion. And now that the French were out of the way, England was telling the colonists, you can't expand west anyways. In the wake of the French-Indian War, approximately 10,000 English soldiers had been left in the colonies. England claimed the troops were there to protect the colonists against future invasions of other nations or against raids by natives, but the colonists felt they were there to intimidate them and to enforce British rule all the more strictly. The issue of troops in the colonies became even worse when Prime Minister George Grenville, the leader of Parliament, passed bills to raise money to pay for the troops being there, considering it the colonists' responsibility to pay for the troops that were there to defend the colonies. Some of this money was also supposed to go towards paying off the war debt from the French-Indian War that England felt the colonies had sort of started to begin with. The first one was the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act placed a tax on sugar and molasses. The molasses was the actual higher impact than the sugar itself, as it was imported and used in the manufacture of rum, which was one of the major exports for the colonies. Some colonists were more upset with the fact that they didn't get a say in the law than they were with the actual taxes themselves. No taxation without representation became the slogan of the idea that the colonists didn't feel obligated to accept a tax that was passed by a parliament that they didn't have a voice in. Samuel Adams said that taxation without representation changed colonists from free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves, basically saying that if they couldn't get a voice in Parliament, a say in the government, they may as well just be servants to England. Still looking to make money to pay off the debt from the war effort, the English implemented the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that certain items have official stamps placed on them like the ones in the picture, indicating the paying of additional tax on those items. Colonists openly protested this one rather than just having meetings in secret. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry, a lawyer, put forward the idea that Virginia should only pay taxes that Virginia got a right to vote on. In Massachusetts, a protest was organized and New York sent a petition to the King and Parliament. Women played a major role in this, as it was their choice as to what was purchased for the homes. Protest groups were organized. Males organized into the Sons of Liberty, which was a boycott organization that tended to go a little overboard on occasion with things such as tar and feathering and violent acts. Women also joined together. Their major pressure was the boycotts. If they wouldn't buy it, the merchants couldn't make a profit off of it. The most effective part of the protests were actually the boycotts. As a result, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but still wouldn't allow colonists a voice in Parliament itself. Another unpopular decision, however, was the passing of the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to supply housing for soldiers. Parliament had figured if the colonists wouldn't pay to support the soldiers, then they would have to actually support them themselves in their homes. England was in a tough spot. When they put taxes on the colonists had boycotted. This resulted in a loss of profit by the merchants, who then threw a fit to Parliament, thus the repeals. However, once the repeals took effect, the English citizens in England, who had had their taxes also raised to pay for the war, were getting upset because they were paying for the war they felt the colonists had actually been the ones to start. In response to this outcry from the English citizens, Parliament once again took action against the colonists. This time under Prime Minister Charles Townshend, they passed the Townshend Acts, which levied taxes on lead, paper, glass, and tea. In addition, Townshend issued writs of assistance, basically allowing people to search any homes they want at any time if they were working for the government. No search warrants required. The Townshend Acts were strictly enforced, but in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and a few other places, non-importation agreements were signed, agreements that the colonies would not buy things from overseas, including from England. In March of 1770, the Townshend Acts were officially repealed by Parliament, but they left the tax on the tea only, just as kind of a symbol that they did have the right to levy taxes without the colonists' permission. Colonists were getting very tired of Parliament deciding their policies from across the sea. British soldiers in the streets were a constant reminder of this. In addition, soldiers were taking part-time jobs in their off hours, which was causing competition for work in the colonies. A lot of times, colonists and soldiers would get into fights in the back alleys over the tension that was growing between the two groups. March 5th, 1770. A crowd of colonists began to cause problems at the custom house. Soldiers were brought in. Colonists began to yell at the soldiers. Snowballs were thrown. Various little harassment issues. At some point, somebody called fire. There's a rumor that the church bells had been rung in order to assemble help for the soldiers, and that somebody had mistaken that for a fire alarm, but to this day we're not sure exactly what happened. English claimed they didn't call fire, colonists claimed they didn't call fire, somebody yelled fire, and the British soldiers opened fire. 5 people died, and one of the first people shot was Crispus Attucks, a black sailor. Many people still consider it ironic that one of the first to die in the Revolution for freedom was a black sailor whose people would not be given freedom by the nation that he had died in the beginnings of creating for another 100 years or so. The English soldiers were put on trial for the event. The English commander claimed that he never gave the order to fire, and as mentioned before, we still don't know where the order to fire came from, presuming that he was telling the truth. All of the soldiers were set free except for 2 who received light punishment. The lawyer at this trial? Sam Adams, cousin John Adams. Colonists kept the memory alive of the Boston Massacre. They wouldn't let anybody forget about it. Sam Adams introduced the idea of committees of correspondence. Each town put together a committee, allowing messengers to travel from one city to another, keeping each city apprised of what the British were up to at what given point. Yet another Prime Minister took control of Parliament, Lord North. He got Parliament to pass the Tea Act. This allowed the East India Company to sell their tea directly to the colonies. While it did allow people to buy tea cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that had been going on, the colonists resisted this act as well. Colonists continued to boycott the tea until a ship called the Dartmouth arrived. Colonists led by John Adams demanded that it leave port. Governor Hutchinson, however, refused to allow it to leave without paying its docking fees, which it could not do without selling the tea. The standoff ended on December 16, 1773, when the colonists boarded the ship and dumped the tea into the harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. When word got back to England, people were extremely upset. Parliament, merchants, they wanted the colonists to pay for the tea. Many people were trying to push for even stricter laws on the colonies, such as William Pitt and Edmund Burke. Parliament passed the Intolerable Act. The Intolerable Acts consisted of 4 acts. The Boston Port Act, which created a barricade of the Boston harbor until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act, which meant that the colonial government was basically run by England directly. The Administration of Justice Act, which meant that the governor could move trials of accused royal officials to another colony or even Great Britain in order to avoid the colonists holding the trial, and the Quartering Act. This Quartering Act made public buildings, libraries, town hall, etc., accessible to barracks the soldiers. In addition, Parliament passed the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act allowed the citizens of Quebec, Canada, where England had taken the area away from the French during the French Indian War, to expand westward, while the Proclamation of 1763 still denied that right to the colonists. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the colonies united even more strongly against Britain. For example, colonies were beginning to smuggle food into Boston in order to avoid the blockade on the harbor. In 1774, September, colonial delegates met at the First Continental Congress, the first union representing the colonies. Some of the people attending this one were Patrick Henry, George Washington, John Adams, Sam Adams, and John Jay, some of the people who would later be known as the Founding Fathers. During the Continental Congress, a plan was put forward similar to Ben Franklin's Albany Plan, but was rejected. This time it was a much closer margin, however. A Declaration of Rights was formed. Congress agreed that Parliament had the right to govern trade, but demanded the removal of British troops and the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. Colonies agreed to continue boycotts and put together groups of Minutemen, colonial soldiers ready to resist British action. The Continental Congress agreed to meet again in the spring before returning to their homes. Unfortunately, before this meeting could take place, things were going to escalate very quickly. The British General Thomas Gage knew that the militias were preparing for conflict. He received orders to take action against colonial leaders by arresting them and to capture colonial supplies of gunpowder, supplies that had been stolen along with 2 cannons from the British Armory. To accomplish his goals, Gage planned a surprise attack and began moving 700 British troops starting at 10 p.m. Little did he know he was being watched. Despite Gage's attempts at secrecy, alerts went out. Lanterns were set in a bell tower in order to signal 2 riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, who headed out across the countryside to spread warning. Also to alert John Adams and John Hancock that they were in danger of being captured. At one point, Revere was even captured. When shots began to be exchanged, the English took his horse, but released Revere because they could not manage the prisoner. With the warning from the riders, by the time the English had arrived at Lexington, the Minutemen were ready and assembled on the town commons. Once they realized how outnumbered they were, the colonial Minutemen were planning to retreat. Before they could, however, a shot was fired and the battle began. The colonists retreated under a hail of gunfire, and that first round is known as the shot heard round the world. 8 colonists died at Lexington. The Minutemen retreated to Concord. After securing the town of Lexington, the English followed them. By the time they reached Concord, they realized that the Minutemen had gained reinforcements. Instead of the 70 that they had originally faced, the British were now pitted against hundreds of Minutemen. Initially, there may not have been a battle. The colonists had retreated out of that town as well and into the wood line. But on seeing smoke from the cooking fires of the British, they thought the town was being burned and rushed back in to the battle. The English were forced to retreat from Concord back to Boston. The entire distance back, they were being chased by the colonists with hit-and-run tactics from behind walls, behind trees. The British were used to open-line fighting in the roads. It's called a set-piece battle, had been very common throughout Europe. The colonists, however, had learned from the Native Americans during the French Indian War and were not lining up straight, exchanging bullets. They were doing guerrilla warfare, hit and run, all the way back to Boston.